Let's talk about the book of Daniel some more. We're on to, we're going to be jumping into chapter 7 through 12. And so we have to talk about the book of Daniel. We've been reading it, but we have to talk about it. Because the book of Daniel presents us with a lot of problems. We talked about some of it last week, so we're going to talk about some more. So let's do it this way, and I've given you the printout of what's up on the screen, because sometimes if I don't do that, there's wailing and gnashing of teeth. All right, which is the scriptural way of saying whining. So anyway, so the first 6 sections of Daniel are the historical sections. And we've already looked at those, okay? Chapter 1, the diet. Chapter 2, the dream. Chapter 3 was the 3 men in the furnace. Chapter 4, the insanity. Chapter 5, Belshazzar's feast. And chapter 6, the lion's den. That's where we've come so far. Okay, so that's the historical section. Those are the stories. Okay, and then there's the prophetic section. That's chapters 7 through 12, and this is where it gets totally strange from our point of view. So this is the stuff that we never cover in Sunday school stories, because most Sunday school teachers don't want to deal with it. So chapter 7, 8, and the rest of the book is kind of laid out like this. Chapter 7 is a vision, a prophecy that Daniel sees in the first year of Belshazzar's reign. Chapter 8 is a vision he sees in Belshazzar's reign in year 3. Chapter 9 he sees in the first year of Darius's reign. And chapter 10 through 12 he sees in the third year of Cyrus's reign. Now, you got to remember that, so the whole reign of Nebuchadnezzar, we don't have any record or recorded visions of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar is the one who has the dreams, and Daniel interprets them, but there's no record that Daniel himself had any visions. He's doing the interpreting for Nebuchadnezzar. It's not until Belshazzar comes along that Daniel has visions. So did Daniel have them this whole time? I don't know. It's just they're not recorded until Belshazzar comes along. So for several decades, Daniel's in the position where he's in Babylon. We just don't know that he's been having visions or dreams. He just doesn't have any. And then there's only these 4 of them that are recorded. So it's difficult to call Daniel a prophet with these 4 visions here. And in fact, in the Hebrew scriptures, the book of Daniel is not included among the other prophets. Okay? The prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, and the minor prophets. But Daniel is included with Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah and the Chronicles and the other books of writings and that kind of stuff. But he's not really included among the prophets, so I'm not sure that they considered him a prophet in the same way as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Jonah, and those guys. So it's kind of hard to tell what to do with Daniel. But we're going to call this the prophetic section, but even that is going to be hard to figure out why. And I'll show you that in a couple of minutes here. But if you go to if you start with chapter 7, for instance, chapter 7, verse 1, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Okay, that's why you should always keep a notepad and a pen next to your bed, so you can write down what you dream. Okay, in case it comes from the Lord. Okay, and chapter 8 says in the third year of Belshazzar, chapter 9. And then chapter 10, 11, 12 are all in the third year of Cyrus. And whether we read these in detail or not, we'll have to see. Okay. So that's the deal. But the problem then is, the problem number 1 of many is there's this issue. when exactly was the book of Daniel written? Okay, now I used to have a book that's still around, maybe Wayne knows this one. Do you know the book Haley's Bible Handbook? You know that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. It was a compact book about this size, and it was blue. And it was a very straightforward Bible handbook. And it pretty much said, we know the book of Daniel was written by Daniel because all you have to do is open your Bible and it says, see, Daniel. It was written by and that was kind of the way that book was written, all right? But it's not, you know, it gave you some good some decent information, but it wasn't very scholarly. So there's two basic ways to think about the book of Daniel. One of them is to say, okay, was the book of Daniel actually written during the exile? Mostly in Babylon and then, you know, tailing off into silence. So was it written during the Babylonian exile? That is to say, was it written, you know, during around these dates while everybody was in Babylon, Daniel and those guys? And mostly the reasons for this is to say, if you look at chapters 1 through 6, they're pretty accurate accounts. They pretty much look like what we know the history of the Israelites were in those days. Okay, that's what happened. That's how they got to Babylon. That's what happened to them in Babylon. Some of the language, and we talked about that a little bit, you know, when I said, you know, it talked about turbans and trousers and things like that, which is what they would have worn in Babylon, as opposed to robes and, you know, that kind of, they would not have worn turbans in Israel. They would have worn them in Babylon. You know, it's a Babylonian thing. So the accuracy of the counts and languages in chapters 1 through 6 seems to point to they would have done that in Babylon. On the other hand, there's a whole other range of thought that says maybe it was written during the intertestamental period. And in case you've never heard that before, these dates are from about 400 or so BC up until the time of Christ. And that is from the end of when the Old Testament was written until the New Testament started. Okay, so the prophets in the Old Testament, they came to an end about 400 BC. They stopped prophesying, and that was it. For about 400 years, there were no more prophecies. And until Jesus came along, that was it. So you had this silent period in Israel's history, and maybe Daniel was written during that point in time. And part of the reasons for that is that some of the prophecies are too accurate. So if you go to chapter 8, for instance, okay, this is in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. Yeah, okay. So in the third, chapter 8, verse 1, in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I had a vision after the one that already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. Okay, so somebody start reading, please, from verse 3.
I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven.
Okay, thank you. And then somebody please read verses 9 through 12.
Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens and threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up as a great prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the hosts of saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and the truth was thrown to the ground.
Okay, thank you. All right, so that's the vision, at least most of it. Got all that? Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
All right, so you got a goat and a ram. All right, verse 15, while I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai, from the canal, calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. Okay, so verse 19, somebody start there, please.
He said, I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power.
Okay, you can stop there. Okay, so all of a sudden, we have some prophecies that, if they were written in 600 BC, are pretty accurate for what happens in the future. That's the argument for saying, well, maybe they were written in the 400s, because they're actually talking about things that actually did happen, but they're too accurate. Okay, so here's what happened. After Cyrus, was the king of the Medes and Persians, that's a double kingdom, the kingdoms of the Medes and Persians. What happened after Cyrus? Well, the kingdoms of the Medes and Persians lasted for a while, and then all of a sudden, about 400 or so BC, what happened? Alexander the Great. Right. He came along and pretty well took over everything from Greece and Egypt all the way over to India and just conquered everything. Okay, and that was his kingdom. And the Greeks ruled that whole area for 400 years. But not Alexander, because Alexander died before he was 40 years old. So when Alexander died, his kingdom was split up and was led into 4 pieces. Okay, and 4 of his generals ruled the 4 pieces of the kingdom. And one of the pieces was, Egypt and south and the whole section south and west of Israel, Egypt and all that included. And another piece was the section north and east of Israel. So Israel was kind of on the intersection between these 2 different kingdoms that were ruled, and that were part of Alexander's empire. So Israel was kind of in the crosshairs, okay? And so for quite a while, the land of Israel was kind of at peace, but eventually there was raised up one of the kings after several hundred years, in about 180, 170 or so BC. There was raised up one of the kings of these Greeks who was, well, you know, a while back we said, you know, we had an evaluation of Pontius Pilate, you know, where one of our members, who shall remain nameless, said Pontius Pilate was an a-hole. Remember that? Well, this king of the Greeks, who was in about 175 BC, his name was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He was a mean bastard, and I will say that. He was an absolute nasty character, and if you read the first and second books of the Maccabees and the apocryphal books of the Bible, which you can find in the Catholic books, he was just a really nasty, evil guy, and you know, bastard is the only right word I can think of for him.
Who was that?
Antiochus Epiphanes.
Okay.
Okay, he was terrible. He was one of the guys from the kingdom to the north of Israel. And by the way, the kingdom to the south of Israel, the ones of Egypt, they were ruled by the Ptolemies, of whose most famous descendant was Cleopatra VII, who had an affair with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony at the same time. You know, just 50 years before Jesus. But anyway, so there's some issue about some people who have said that maybe these prophecies are too accurate. How would they know that this is the Medes and Persians? How would they know that this is the king of Greece? In 600 years before Jesus, you know, 200 years before these events happened, how would they know that the king of Greece was going to do this? How would they know that the Medes and Persians, how would they know that his kingdom was going to split up? How would they know 200 years ahead of time? That's too accurate. So there's a theory that says maybe somebody who lived later on, you know, so if you say, okay, these events, maybe somebody who lived during these times wrote this section of Daniel later and then said Daniel wrote it. So it'd be like saying, it'd be kind of like somebody in our day saying, I found this manuscript by Alexander Hamilton that completely contradicts, or at least gives all kinds of additional evidence to the way things were during the time of the American Revolution, and it's an authentic document, and we can tell because of all these various things. And you know, and they find this because, you know, they claim that Alexander Hamilton actually wrote it, you know, and then somebody looks at it and goes, oh yeah, we got to publicize that, we got to put it on as a play, you know, we got to do whatever it is that they're doing with Hamilton these days. But it would be that kind of thing. But if somebody said, for instance, that the words of the play Alexander Hamilton were actually written by Hamilton, you know, but just said, this is what, but he wrote it in those days, so that we could say Hamilton was predicting this is what was going to happen. So there's that argument that perhaps the book of Daniel, at least this section, was not written 600 years before Christ, but it was actually written 200 years before Christ, so that they could claim that Daniel had predicted everything that was going to happen 600 years before Christ. So in other words, rather than it being a prophecy, it's maybe, is it like historical fiction? Okay, so the question that we have is the book of Daniel a book of prophecy, or is it a book of historical fiction? Is it like a look back? Okay, now we are acquainted with historical fiction because we know what historical fiction looks like. Because we have books of fiction that took place in historical times. Little House on the Prairie, right? Tom Sawyer, right? All these things are books that took place in the past, you know? War and Peace, okay, they took place, some of them are distant past, some of them are not so distant, at least from the point of view of the author, okay? But if the author then comes along and tries to pass off that work, you know, if the author of say, War and Peace tries to come and pass off that work as a genuine work from somebody from that time period, you know, as then prophetic, you know, and say, this is a prophecy of what's gonna happen in the future, then they're gonna scratch our heads on that and say, what's he trying to do? So the question about the book of Daniel is the book of Daniel, are we gonna think about it as if it's a prophecy or a book of historical fiction? And I gotta tell you, about half the writers out there, about half the people in Christianity think it's not a prophecy. About half of them think it's just historical fiction. Okay? There are some who think it is a prophecy. And there are others who think it's historical fiction. All right. But that's not all. The next question is, how accurate are the visions foretelling future empires? So if you're going to say it's a prophecy, which I'm going to tell you now, I think it is a prophecy, but how accurate are the visions foretelling future empires? All right, that's the next question. How accurate are these things? And then I have to say, there's accuracy, and then there's accuracy. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a little bit. Okay. So here's a problem. The more accurate you think the prophecies are, the more you have to account for the action of God in the narrative. So in other words, if you're going to say the book of Daniel was written in 600 or so, and then they're prophesying what's going to happen 200 years later, you got to say God has got something to do with this. Okay? Yeah. If you're going to say Daniel wrote this in 600 about things that are going to happen 200 years later, God had to have something to do with that. Either telling him what to write or bringing about what he said was going to write. God had to have something to do with this. Okay? But if you're going to say the visions are look-backs or historical fiction, then the less you have to account for God. Okay? Because then you're just saying, well, this is just something that Daniel did. Daniel is just looking at the historical sequence and saying, well, this, and then Daniel just put names to things, and you know, so God didn't really have anything to do with it. It's all a composition of Daniel.
Daniel authoring the look back. Though.
Yeah, Daniel authoring the look back. You know, and God didn't have that much to do with it.
How could Daniel author the look back if it was written after he was gone?
Well, you know, maybe Daniel didn't. He just, you know, whoever wrote it put Daniel's name to it.
Daniel's name. Okay.
Put Daniel's name to it.
I have a hard time with that, because if we start to question these prophecies, why wouldn't we question any other prophecies that are in the Bible? I have a hard time picking things out and saying, that probably really isn't right. Then pretty soon you're questioning everything in there.
Well, as it turns out, Pam, there's quite a bit of that goes on in biblical scholarship. Yeah.
I guess.
All the way to, you know, all the way to things about, well, maybe Jesus didn't exactly say all the things that we think he said, you know?
Yeah, I don't want to be that.
I know.
Or maybe Jesus wasn't even here, or maybe Jesus
Yes.
wasn't the Son of God. Once you start questioning things like that, you just keep going.
Yes, and there's quite a bit of that goes on in the biblical scholarship world. And the unfortunate, and I will say this because it's being recorded, the unfortunate part of that whole deal is that most of the time, those kind of guys are the ones they focus on specials on television.
Yeah.
Yes.
you know?
So the aliens came.
Yeah, well, it's not only when the aliens came, but it's when, oh, we suddenly discovered a new manuscript that talks about the intimate relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter that eventually somebody comes up and says, you know what, this is phony manuscript, and we've got all kinds of good scientific evidence to prove it's a phony manuscript. Nevertheless, the first one to the, the first one to the gate is the one that everybody still
Yeah.
buys into. And it's like, oh, we heard that Jesus had a relationship with Mary Magdalene. He did not. Give it a rest.
More, it's more
You know,
interesting or more spectacular.
it's
Anything that's
The
salacious.
fake
salacious.
Right.
Salacious is the
Fake
word.
news.
Fake news.
Yeah.
And yet that's the way people are. So, but that's what people do. Ooh, let's find. And I'm not even going to go into some of the other stuff that I've heard because it's just downright stupid and nasty. But that's what people do. Let's find out more stupid things. But the real issue is if we consider them to be prophecies, and we're going to consider the more accurate we think they are, the more we have to account for the action of God. Okay, and there are people who just, even in biblical scholarship, who don't want to admit that God is active. They just don't want to think He's in there. Okay, it's a leak over from that kind of scientific thing that says we don't want to admit that God is active in anything, even in biblical scholarship. Okay. So let's talk about how we interpret some things. There's a lot of numbers and dates in here. If we could stay in chapter 18, for instance. Chapter 8, yeah, chapter 18, verse 4, yeah. Or chapter 8, verse 14. Okay. Let's try chapter 8, verse 14. The Holy One, 13 and 14, I heard a Holy One speaking, and another Holy One said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot. He said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. Well, we think that's probably a reference, and remember I talked about Antiochus Epiphanes, who is in about 180, 170 or so BC. And the Maccabees revolted against him. And they had this massive rebellion, this Jewish rebellion, because he was just a nasty, nasty guy. He would have been friends with both Hitler and Attila the Hun if he could have. And he did all kinds of nasty things, but he put up a statue of Zeus in the temple of God in Jerusalem. He made sacrifices to Zeus in the temple. And eventually the Jews rebelled against him, destroyed the temple, not the temple, the statue of Zeus, got rid of all that stuff, rededicated the temple, and in the festival of rededication of the temple, Hanukkah happened, okay, the festival of lights, okay, so that's how Hanukkah came about, just briefly. But how long did that all take? This says 2,300 evenings and mornings. That's an indication, an example of the numbers and dates, and there's all kinds of numbers and dates in Daniel, okay, 2,300 this, and this many times and seasons and whatnot. But here's the issue here. How do we determine them and interpret them? Precisely or broadly? Okay? If we interpret them too broadly, like we just say, okay, 2,300 just means a long time, then the numbers or dates may lose all meaning. We just say, I don't know, they just don't mean anything. But if we interpret them too precisely, the specific interpretation becomes misleading. They're too specific, and they mislead us in a couple of different directions. One is, you might end up focusing on the wrong answer. Okay? So, It's kind of like we talked about with the Antichrist with Revelation. You know, if you say, this one is the Antichrist, and you're so focused on this one being the Antichrist, you might actually miss the real Antichrist because you're focused on this one is the Antichrist. You know, and then you say, oh, no, that one over there was the Antichrist, we got it wrong. And you're not ready for it to be wrong, okay, so you're focused on the wrong answer. The other one is, you do shut down other possibilities. Somebody else comes along and says, well, what about these other guys over there? No, I'm so determined that this one is the right answer. You shut down other possibilities. And so it's helpful sometimes not to be quite so precise. It's sometimes helpful to say, let's just be a little bit vaguer about what we're talking about. What are these 2,300 evenings and mornings all about? You know, I'm not real sure entirely. I think they might be, but I'm open to other, you know, other interpretations. I'm not going to be nailing these down necessarily. I'm going to say more than it's a long time, but I'm not going to say exactly what it should be. And my personal opinion here is how you answer this question may depend as much on your personality as on anything else, okay? And, you know, I've got some icons of personalities here, you know, but I think it depends on your personality and to a certain extent on your training. You know, if you're the kind of person who is, you know, the extreme attention to detail kind of person, you're going to get really upset with, you know, with somebody who says, yeah, 2,300 is more or less. You know, should it be 2,313? You know, I want it to be that exact and a half. Or, you know, is 2,300 just a kind of a round number and let's leave it go with that? I think for me, you know, and listen, I was a math major in college, so I can do details pretty well if I have to. But I don't like to because sometimes I think it's totally overblown when you need to. Okay. So 2,300 to me is like, yeah, that's all right. 2,300 means it's going to take a while, you know, but I don't have to be nailing it down to an exact thing. But there are some people who interpret Scripture, and they're decent biblical scholars, who just seem to want to nail it down to an exact number and say, what does this exactly mean? Down to the second. I'm like, yeah, no, I don't think we need to do that. I don't think we need to do that. So.
I got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've heard, I'm gonna call certain people stumbling blocks before the children of God about these prophecies, especially in Daniel. They know the end times, they can run it right down to the gate. The Son of God is gonna appear in a clean house.
Yeah.
Some of them think that a day really means a year. I've heard that shtick too. And of what my conclusion is that some of these people are just out to sell a book. So
Yes. Book tables in the back. You know,
So
yeah.
And there's another thing that gets me is when it's written in here, the end times, I'm assuming, is it the end times of when they go back into Israel, when they're released from Babylon, or is it the real end times? I can interpret it that way. I don't know.
Yeah, see,
Can you give me a clue?
yeah, see, that's where Daniel is kind of mushy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because, you know, this one, at least in chapter 8, is talking about, this is a prophecy about the end times, but he's clearly talking about Alexander's empire and what comes after Alexander's empire, and he's clearly talking about at least up until just almost the time of Jesus. But that's all, he doesn't go too much further than that.
Okay, all right.
You know, that's
So we're
it.
in that time period. We're not at the And-
Yeah, I mean,
and-
we're like 2,000 years later than what this
Yeah,
is talking
yeah,
about is
yeah.
the end times. So,
Well, look, you
Yeah.
put that up for me, I mean,
yeah, so, I mean, what Daniel chapter 8 says is the end times. It seems pretty clear, at least to me. We're 2,000 years beyond that, and I'm not real sure how to, how to deal with that. You know,
Could
is
it
that
be
the
both?
end times? No. Go ahead.
Could it be both?
Well, I don't know if it could be both, at least not in chapter 8.
No, not in 8.
No, because in chapter 8, he's
There's a
talking,
lot in Revelations that comes back to Daniel.
well, in Revelation, there's some, no, I guess I want to say in Revelation, there are echoes of Daniel.
Okay.
I'd rather say there's echoes of Daniel, where you go, I think I've heard something like this before, but it's different in Revelation. You know, rather than a one-to-one exact scientific kind of correspondence. You know? I mean, I guess I wanna say something like this. This is kinda how I feel about it. My eyesight is really pretty bad. And so I wear contact lenses all the time. And even with contact lenses, it doesn't make things entirely super clear all the time. All right? So, if I'm driving down the highway and I see an exit sign for an off-ramp, sometimes I'm glad to be able to read what it says on the exit sign for the off-ramp so that I can get off the off-ramp or not. I don't feel like I need to be able, from 500 yards away, I don't feel like I need my vision to be so precise that I have to be able, from 500 yards away at 70 miles an hour, to be able to count all the rivets on the sign. Okay? I don't feel that I need to be able to do that. Okay, but I think all I need to be able to do is to be able to look at that sign and have a clear enough vision or enough of a, to be able to say, oh look, the sign says get off here, but I don't want to get off here, so I'm not getting off here. And I feel that way about scriptural prophecy. I don't have to be able to look at all the rivets in detail and say, this is exactly what this means. I just need to be able to say, it's either pointing to this or it's not. And I know that flies in the face of a lot of people who are teaching scriptural prophecy out there, who want to look at all the rivets, and they want to see how the sign is planted in the ground and all that other kind of stuff, but it's like, I just don't. I just don't want to do that. Does that make, now if you're the kind of person who wants to count rivets, I can point you to people who like to count rivets and say, you might want to watch some of their videos and get some of their Bible studies or studies and whatnot, but it's just not me. Maybe that has to do with the personality issue. Okay. I'd rather say, does this point to Jesus or doesn't it?
I don't count rivets, but I take a literal interpretation of the book, but I'm still open to other ideas.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good to be open to other ideas as long as the opening is there. In this case, in chapter 8, it's a pretty, I'm not sure that the opening is there. If it says, this is about the kings of Greece and Medes and Persians and, you know, that kind of stuff. I think it's a pretty straightforward interpretation, because that's what Scripture says it is, and that's another issue. How do we interpret what Scripture says? So let's go on, because that's another issue here. And animals are a good example of this. Okay, so what do animals represent? So if we go back to chapter 7, you know, we had the goat and the ram already, all right? And in chapter 7, Daniel had a dream, and in verse 2 he says, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the 4 winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. So somebody read verse 4, just verse 4.
The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it.
Thank you. Somebody else read verse 5.
And there before me was a second beast which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh.
Okay, so it had been to a cook-off that day. Okay, somebody read just verse 6.
After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. The beast had 4 heads, it was given authority to rule.
Okay, thank you, and somebody read just verse 7.
After that, in my vision at night,